Mr. Dold from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for taking the time to be with us. And I certainly know, I guess, one of the advantages of waiting while there's votes is that we get to ask the questions. So I am concerned and wanted to talk to you about the China currency bill that currently just got passed, actually, by the United States Senate. And in somebody that represents a district that exports over $1 billion over to China, I'm obviously concerned about what kind of ramifications this has. Currently, we've had little word from the administration about what their plans are. A lot of other bills, we hear that the President's going to put his veto threat out there. If this were to pass through, would your recommendation be to the White House to veto the bill or to sign it?
Well, as the White House said yesterday, and I'll just repeat their language just to be careful, if this bill were to advance, then Congress would or should address the concerns that have been raised about the consistency of some provisions with our international commitments. But let me just say,
specifically with the World Trade obligation.
Yes. Now, we have a problem, though, which is that I think we all need China to let their currency rise more rapidly, and we need to find a more effective way to address a whole range of practices the Chinese continue to do to subsidize disadvantaged U.S. companies, steal intellectual property, force transfer technology, and we are very concerned about that, working very hard to address them, and we have not made enough progress. We want to build on that progress.
If the bill were to go, and sometimes you have the opportunity to say we want you to address those things, and sometimes they do and sometimes Congress doesn't. If the bill were to go in its current form, right now from the United States Senate to the President's desk, your recommendation would be what?
Well, as I said, if this bill were to advance, we'd want Congress to address the concerns that exist about the design of those provisions that would violate our international commitments. That's what I would say. Okay. Well, I won't go beyond that for reasons you can appreciate.
If I can just jump to something else. Overseas regulators have made it clear that they will potentially not follow the lead in the United States on a number of provisions that are a prominent feature of our regulatory reform, including the Volcker Rule and swaps push-out, more specifically with Section 17 or 716. Shouldn't this make you skeptical that they will not harmonize their rules with those of the United States on other important provisions as well?
I'm a little worried about that. But, we never could have expected that the world would match us identically for specific provisions we thought were in our interest of protecting our system. But I think we have a very good chance, as I said earlier, on the fundamental things that determine the economics of finance here and around the world in capital, liquidity, derivatives, margin, et cetera, that we have we're going to work very hard to make sure we come to a common position so we don't see that material shift in activity outside the United States to the disadvantage of U.S. firms.
I had some other questions with regard to the FSOC specifically and derivatives, but Congressman Royce went over those, so I'll just jump on to something else. The SIFI designation, which you are in the process right now of going to try to take a look at those. About how many U.S. companies do you think would fall into that SIFI designation?
Can't tell yet.
Rough estimate.
Don't know yet, but I'll tell you what we're trying to do. We're trying to define the mix of size and risk that we think requires, say, a closer look about whether those institutions should be subject to the type of constraints we put on banks in terms of capital and leverage. That's the motivation for this. It's a very important thing to do because, in our crisis, we had a huge buildup of risk outside the system alongside banks doing basically what banks are doing.
Sure.
And that was devastating. And so we're trying to make sure the scope of that authority will extend to institutions that fell outside of those safeguards but need to be under them.
If I could just go out, we don't like to deal in hypotheticals, right, but if we can, I know there's specific companies out there that have actually filed Chapter 11, that have gone through a bankruptcy reorganization. Wouldn't that, by sheer definition, make them outside of a SIFI designation?
Well, we've had, centuries, decades of experience with banking and financial crisis. And
I certainly don't mean to say that you don't.
No, I'm not saying we as a country, unfortunately. And what we learned as a country in that context is that banks or institutions that are like banks, they take on leverage, they borrow short, lend long, assets are liquid, vulnerable to runs. Those institutions require a modified bankruptcy regime to deal with them because of the risk that, you suck the oxygen out of them and they come crashing down. And, the way bankruptcy works, normally under the corporate context, you need somebody to be able to lend in a DIP financing rule, and you need to adapt that model, as we did after the S&L crisis in particular, to give a special way, and Dodd-Frank did, to make sure you can adapt that same basic principle to institutions that are structured with that mix of leverage and liquidity risk.
Well, I will, and I appreciate my time is now, but I do want to just mention that was up and met with a company that actually has gone through the bankruptcy process, did not suck that oxygen out of the air, and yet they are considered under that SIFI designation as of right now, and I would simply argue.
Nobody's under it yet.
Well, they fear.
They fear.
And I think rightfully so, that they will be put under these constraints. Right. And I would just certainly like to caution to you and to those that are making these decisions that if there's an organized way already existing in the laws that they would not fall under that SIFI designation. We want to make sure that we're not casting as wide a net and more of a narrowly tailored net if possible.
Fair point, and we're going to try to get that balance right. And I think if the Council adopts this guidance, people have a lot more clarity about the criteria we're going to propose, and have a chance to comment on that criteria for who should be in.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for your time.